History detectives. Who wouldn't like to be a history detective? I'm excited about encouraging young people to explore their local history and to dig into historical documents and write. I'm Sarah Campbell. Let's get started. I've found that students can be more engaged in learning the history when it's told from the viewpoint of the child. Can you remember when you first read a story like Johnny Tremain and suddenly all of that history became more real? Finding clues in primary sources really gives them an idea about how a history book is written. Where did that information come from? Nonfiction writing is so important, and it depends on finding and documenting those sources. It's all about telling a story that's never been told before. That's what really gets me going. There are all kinds of pieces of history that may have been completely forgotten, and you can discover it. Original records can be found in your town and city hall. Of course, classroom work is going to depend on internet records, but it's not all online. Let me show you what I found in my city hall. I was flipping through a history book, one of the early records of Irving, Mass., and I came across this page, and there was no way I could flip right by it. It says that I, John Ames of Irving, give to James Buss, my son, Wallace Ames. He was 10 years old on January 16th, and he's given until he shall be 21 years of age, to clothe and to school in sickness and health. And this document was written in 1863. Now I took a look at this, and you can see the scribbles and the handwriting and how it was recorded in the town. And it's the kind of thing that could be called indentured servitude, which we think of as more in colonial times, or an early form of foster care. But clearly this was a family that couldn't take care of his children and found someone local who was willing to take them on. Census records are one of the first sources that a history detective is going to look at. The federal census is taken every 10 years, so because that document was from 1863, I took a look at 1860. And I found in Northfield, right next door to Irving, John Ames and his family. We can see there John was a farmer. He's listed with his wife Susan, or we assume she's his wife, and their children, Eunice, Henry, and Wallace. So here's Wallace, the boy that was the subject of that document, and he's 7 years old. We can do a little math. It's 3 years earlier, and yes, sure enough, he would have been 10 in 1863. If you look in the column here, you can see that they didn't own any property. So he was a farmer, but he was working for someone else. Maybe the gentleman listed above him there, Solomon Marsh. And the 3 children over here said that they'd been to school in the past year. Now, a history detective might know that Massachusetts took a census in 1855, so we don't have to wait 10 full years for another piece of evidence. In the Massachusetts census, I found the Ames family again in Northfield, and there they are, John and Susan, with Eunice and Henry and Wallace. So we know they were in that area for a while, and we're going to build up our evidence with more clues. Another very important source of evidence for a history detective are the vital records. Those are births, deaths, and marriages that are located in each town. I went to the Northfield records, which are found online, and I found a birth in 1853 to John and Susan Ames. Now in this case, the clerk didn't even record the first names of the children. And as you can see in the third column, only a few were marked whether they were female or male. But we can see that John and Susan's name is there, and it's in the right time period to have been little Wallace's birth. So we believe this is his birth record, right there in Northfield. Similarly, I also found the other 2 children in the Northfield records. Then we jump ahead to 1865, when Massachusetts took another census. I looked for James Buss, the man who was mentioned in that document. And here's James. His wife, Emma Jean, they have a little girl, Mary. She's only 4, so she couldn't help on the farm. And we find Wallace at 12 and another boy, Asa Packard, who was 13. So it looks like this family was taking on help with 2 boys that weren't related to them. And you can see in the far column that James was a farmer. Now, I had high hopes. Maybe Wallace was being apprenticed to some important silversmith, but it was just a farmer. But there wasn't that much going on in Irving at that time. Now, taking these clues and other clues that I find, I create a timeline. And a timeline is so important to putting all your data in order. You can solve a mystery by organizing your clues and looking for gaps and figuring out when all these events happened. We can see where the children were born at the beginning of the timeline. The census tells us where they lived, in Northfield, and then to Irving. Continuing on, I also found a marriage record. And at that point, Wallace had kind of swapped his middle name and his first name, so he became George W. Ames. But he got married in 1875 in Royalston, which is a nearby town. In the 1880 census, I found George with his wife Jenny, and they had 2 children, Walter and Bessie, and Susan Ames was also living with them. So I like to think this was kind of a happy ending to a sad story, because whatever happened back when George or Wallace was a child, he kept in touch with his mother and she was living with him again and enjoying her grandchildren. And jumping ahead to the 1900 census, they were living in New Hampshire, which is close by. I also found a cemetery record for George W. Ames. He was buried in Keene, New Hampshire. So I've been able to pick up the clues that take him from birth to death and fill in a few events in between and start to create a story of his life. Old maps are a wonderful clue for a history detective. When you find a map that was made at the time the people lived, you can get an idea of how the town looked, what the features were. And on some of these maps, you see names, and circled there in red is J.M. Buss. So we can see where Wallace would have lived with Mr. Buss, just north of the center of Irving. And we can look for features like the neighbors. We can look for a school, maybe, see how far he had to walk to school. So maps are wonderful when you can find one that comes in the period that you're looking. Now, newspapers can go a long way to add to the clues. When newspapers are digitized, they can be searchable online, and we can look by name or by location or by event. These are available in a variety of places. But the old newspapers used to carry little spots about all kinds of things that happened. People visiting, in addition to marriages or births. But in this case, we have a record of a fire. The house and barn belonging to James M. Buss of Winchester, New Hampshire, burned. Now, this newspaper was from 1898, so Wallace had grown up and married and moved away by then. But it's interesting to see that Mr. Buss lived in New Hampshire and so did Wallace, so they may have been friends throughout their lives. Cemeteries are a terrific source of information for a history detective. You may wonder, did anyone famous live in your town? Now, this stone is quite a bit bigger than the other stones around it. This is located in Northfield Farms Cemetery. And you can see this must have been a prominent person, Mr. Field. So I took a look at the back of the stone, and what did I find? Mr. Field was the discoverer and collector of fossil footprints in the sandstone beds at Turner's Falls, Massachusetts. Now, we might not have known that. We might want to do more research on this individual, find out who he was, if he lived here all his life, if he had children. There's all kinds of clues a history detective can find to make a good story about a piece of granite like this. Many, many people in history served in the various wars, so war monuments are a great way to find subjects. In this case, the students I showed this slide to recently were quick to notice that there were 4 Packard brothers here who all served in the Civil War. So finding out what happened to those Packard brothers would be a terrific project. Some of a person's personality can be revealed in a will they wrote. These are also available online. In this case, it was an elderly woman, which is quite unusual for a woman to be writing a will. But it shows how important her possessions were to her, because she gives her granddaughter a cap, an apron, a sheet, a napkin, 1 plate, and a tablecloth. So these were the parts of her household that she felt were hers, and she wanted to make sure they were divided in the way she wanted them to be divided. And it was more important to her for the children each to get something, a handkerchief, a plate, than to have the whole set go together somewhere. So she clearly wanted them to remember her with these objects. There are also very valuable records found in the probate when someone dies without a will, because their possessions had to be completely inventoried. And I think an inventory like this is a wonderful project that almost paints a picture. You could close your eyes and you could imagine the appraisers walking into the house and looking at every single object they see. It's also an interesting vocabulary lesson. Now, I knew that a secretary was a name for a desk, but the seraphine there further down made me think a little harder. So, could have looked something like that. Of course, there's math involved in designing a pedigree chart, because those ancestors multiply pretty quickly. You may have 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, and so on. Now, I realize we have to be sensitive to non-traditional families, but it's a good example of how the numbers increase pretty quickly as time goes on. You may be able to find an interesting ancestor back 3 or 4 generations without being able to fill in all the blanks there. So it's always a good question to ask. Is there a mystery in your family? Have you asked your grandparents about their life? There's so many writing opportunities involved in local history and making history local. And the outcome of all this is writing a story, writing a nonfiction story, or maybe embellishing it into a fiction story. It can be told verbally. There are obviously lots of pictures that can go with it. Or maps. Drawing maps is a lot of fun. Understanding the routes people took, maybe finding the different places they lived. We can share the documents. And we can tell our own life story as students of history. Who remembers their first day of school? If you don't write it down, maybe your grandchildren will be wondering someday what your life was like. We all need to share our story. I believe being a history detective is all about empowering the students to tell those forgotten stories of hidden history. Let's solve a mystery. There's so many places to look. We can start online, we can add with local resources, and we can produce a document that tells everyone about the exciting things we found.